are the signs that it seems to suggest that the outside of Xi Jinping, the Li Keqiang become another center for the power, and there are two different directions about the national development. And some people, especially, they are very disappointed about the way Xi Jinping handled the COVID. Right now, they are flocking around the Li Keqiang, and so that we started to see like two centers. But I personally do not see the signs or the evidence suggesting that Xi Jinping anyway will not be able to succeed in his third term. Of course, all the internal struggles, basically the CCP itself is very opaque. No one could actually see through what is happening there, just like the Xi Jinping.
The Indo-Pacific is where the future of the world will be written. That's according to US President Joe Biden, who's just wrapped up his first tour to Asia. So, how successful was his trip? Welcome to Taiwan Plus Point, offering insight and analysis on the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Ian Kavat, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lai Yizhong, who is the CEO of Prospect Foundation, one of Taiwan's foremost think tanks, and Mr. Tonglun Guo, Deputy Editor-in-Chief at one of Taiwan's leading newspapers, the United Daily News. Thank you both for joining Point today. Dr. Lai, during his trip to Japan, Joe Biden said that the US would get involved militarily to defend Taiwan. Why has this statement triggered so much debate?
So that sort of been perceived as deviating from the traditional position of the United States about strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan. And if you look at the past U.S. High-level official statement regarding Taiwan, its basic language is that the U.S. will help Taiwan to defend itself. And the last time the U.S. president very specifically talked about the defense of Taiwan, other than President Joe Biden, is the President Bush. And President Bush in year 2001. So this time it seems that the Joe Biden president is actually giving the yes about the using force, the United States force, to intervene in the Taiwan Strait issue. So that generated a lot of the interest from the outside. But of course, later on, like 10 or 20 minutes later, we have another statement coming from White House again for it had been perceived as trying to walk back of the President Biden, what he said regarding the issue. So that they continue to stress that strategic ambiguity, the policy, and hasn't been changed, and as well as the U.S. One China policy.
Tonglun, do you welcome Biden's comments?
It's not for me to comment whether I welcome or not, but certainly it's a good thing for Taiwan. And I would say that a lot of comments have been that he's a slip of the tongue, but I don't think so, because he is kind of expected when he comes to Asia. A lot of cases have been comparing Taiwan with Ukraine over a couple of months now. So he must be expecting this kind of question will come up when he had an open press conference, right?
Let me read some exact words, because Dr. Lai, you mentioned the One China policy. He said, "We agreed with the One China policy, we signed onto it, but the idea that it can be taken by force, Taiwan, is just not appropriate. It would dislocate the entire region and would be another action similar to Ukraine." So where does that leave us in terms of the One China, or the US's One China policy, Dr. Lai?
Well, traditionally, U.S. always insists that its One China policy is very different from what Chinese, the One China principles. And if you look at the policy toward Taiwan, especially the Taiwan Relations Act, also mentioned about the peaceful resolutions of the Taiwan issue. So that I think that it's no wonder that some PRC scholars started to argue that the United States intentionally trying to hollows the whole One China concept by saying that yes, we stick to One China policy, but in practices they are doing everything outside of One China. So those are the interesting development.
Tonglun, Can I ask you, do you believe that the US can still support its one China policy, as well as Biden said, intervene militarily to defend Taiwan?
I think one of the things that come out from the U.S. One China policy is that it had put up with a new condition, meaning that the precondition is China cannot use force to achieve its unification. Of course, U.S. will agree that that Taiwan and China can be unified in the future, but this have to go through in a peaceful means and have to depends on Taiwan's people's own will, that you cannot force upon the Taiwan people will by force. I think that is gradually the consensus now in the United States, both for Democrat and Republican. And this is something is really a great change that is happening for U.S. One China policy, that the U.S. cannot stand by and let China use force to achieve its unification purpose.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lai, do you agree about that? Or is it that the US actually doesn't take a position?
The US does not take any position on the Taiwan's sovereignty or the status in its relation with China. And also international scholar, especially the scholarly or the legal counselor within the State Department, still maintain the position that the United States still maintains the so-called Taiwan status undetermined, that legal interpretation regarding Taiwan. So that that is a part of the development of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So that no, the United States does not take the position whether Taiwan is a part of China. And I will say that recently that the U.S. Is close to publicly disrecognize the Taiwan as a part of PRC. And of course, a similar statement has already been said by Pompeo while he was a Secretary of State in year 2020. He said Taiwan is never a part of China, has never been a part of China. So that has been said, but I think this administration, although it's not very publicly stated statement like those, but the actual did so more or less reflected that position.
Mm. Would you agree with the calls for strategic ambiguity to become strategic clarity?
Right now, the strategic ambiguity does not seem to serve the function to deter China from its military maneuver or the aggression against Taiwan. From year 2016 and onward, we started to see the Chinese military assets, whether that's aircraft or the vessels, keep approaching the Taiwan and in a more aggressive manners. Last year, we already have about 1,000 Chinese aircrafts enter Taiwan's ADIZ. And this year, I think the pace will be, it will break the record last year. And also the issue about the Chinese international isolation campaign against Taiwan in the last 2 or 3 years also intensified. But now that it seems that all the international gatherings, as long as it's international, no matter it's a political or non-political, the Chinese position is that no, Taiwan cannot step into those gatherings. And that kind of the increase our international campaign against Taiwan.
You raise a very good point there. Joe Biden recently signed into law a bill to authorize Washington to back Taiwan's bid to take part in the WHO and other international organizations. Tong Lun, just going back to what he said in the press conference, he did link the fate of Ukraine and Taiwan, and he said, he said that Russia must pay a long-term price. Otherwise, what signal does that send to China about the cost of it attempting to take Taiwan by force? If we can talk about deterrence, if we can talk about Biden's comments in relation to deterrence, do you think that there was a clear message from Biden?
Let me get back to the strategy of ambiguity. I mean, this strategy will serve as a double deterrence. One deterrence is against that China cannot never guess what the U.S. will react, since it will face with a huge retaliation from the U.S. military. And the other deterrent is that the U.S. may not give Taiwan a blank check for independence. I think both of those deterrents have been worn out over the years. I mean, now China, of course, is assuming that the U.S. will intervene, and then China is building up its military in order to respond to this. And also, Taiwan has become more like a democracy, more and more. And there's no way to, it's very hard for U.S. to stop Taiwan from expressing itself internationally or domestically. So that is the reason why there is a talk about coming out with a new strategy to replace this strategy of ambiguity. So hence the strategy of clarity coming out. But I think so far it's still very hard for, I mean, on the one hand, we are seeing the deterrence part is still, is much in the working right now. And it should be maintained and holding from now on. And on the other hand, I think Taiwan government, even DPP is become the ruling party, they are not pursuing those independent policy. And they are saying that Taiwan is still, it's already an independent country. So there's no need for seeking de jure independence. So I think coming down, there still need a lot of room for a new policy should be coming out from the US.
Mm-hmm. A day after Biden's comments, Dr. Lai, 4 Chinese and Russian bombers flew close to or into Japan's and South Korea's air defense zone. And since then, China has also announced military drills around Taiwan. But why didn't we see a reaction that was much stronger and more immediate following Biden's comments?
I thought that signal about the China's and the Russian military aircraft joined together, flying across the Japan and South Korea, that already sent very strong signals. I'm just wondering that should Stringer want to be any stronger, what would that be? Firing missiles to the Japan Sea?
I think because there are only 4, right? And we're used to how many? 20 in a day?
In the past, that we last year, we do see that there are the 10 ships fly from China, from Russia. They sort of encircle the whole Japan during one exercise, and also the China and the Russia, but separately enter or the flow the proximity to the Japan airspace. So this is the time that the China and the Russia, they flew together. They flew together, and right after the Quad meeting. So it is not just about U.S.-Japan. It's about the joint response to the Quad. So it means 2 things. First of all, despite the outside observers looking at the possible drift between China and Russia, especially looking at the Russian military performances in the invasion against Ukraine, at least the Chinese action this time is telling everyone that we're still with Russia, and this is an axis we are bonding together. And second, this is the direct response to the Quad.
Tonglong, would you agree that it's a symbol of their no limits partnership? And how does the US, or how does the US trilateral group, US, South Korea, Japan, how would they take that message?
I think it's really a very clumsy response from Russia and China. I mean, for the China's sake, China had been saying to the US and the world that they are not in alliance with Russia in terms of the Ukraine affairs. Now you are proving yourself that you are really in a military alliance by having this joint flight with Russia. And as for Russia, the Quad joint statement had been avoid mentioning the name of Russia because India had been objecting to this. And now Russia is now coming up hand in hand with China in response to Quad. I mean, these are very clumsy response. I don't think they are acting very well according to this, right?
Mm-hmm. Would you agree, Dr.?
Yeah, I think that's exactly that. Also shows the kind of the subjugation by the Russia to China, so that some people argue that at the invasion of Ukraine is the Putin hijacking Xi Jinping into his war on Ukraine. But I think that this time the response by the Russia flew with China to the Quads. Basically, Russia is listening or working through the Chinese command for this. So yeah, that's a clumsy response.
Okay. You mentioned Xi Jinping. There's been some speculation recently that Xi Jinping's grip on power may be faltering. Tonglun, could I ask you, why has there been this speculation of infighting among Chinese leadership?
There's a very strong resentment about the lockdown of the COVID, especially in Shanghai and the coastal provinces, and also the economic slowdown coming out of this. I mean, this is a major crisis for China, especially in terms of economic slowdowns. So we are seeing that the other group, which is led by Li Keqiang, the prime minister, is gaining more and more publicity these days. They are either showing on the People's Daily or they are in the CCTV, calling for people to increase their production. They are reviving all those like Alibaba or Tencent, and then try to regain their momentum. They're even encourage the real estate speculation in that regard. So I think with October is the 20th Party Congress coming near in, I think there is tremendous pressure on Xi Jinping. And also, this is the time they have to decide on the next 5 years personnel. So there's rumor always about in August there's a Beidaihe meeting, and now is the time that people are trying to figure out who is going to be the 7 standing committee member of political bureau in the next round. So I think Xi Jinping is under tremendous pressure because of this, and if the economics cannot speed up in the next couple of months, if the COVID cannot be fight correctly and then successfully, Xi Jinping will have a hard time try to make himself a legitimate leader for the next 5 years.
Dr. Lai, do you agree that this history-making third term, if I've read what you said correctly, could be in doubt?
I have to say that yes, there are the signs that it seems to suggest that the outside of Xi Jinping, the Li Keqiang become another center for the power, and there are two different directions about the national development. And some people, especially, they are very disappointed about the way Xi Jinping handled the COVID. Right now, they are flocking around the Li Keqiang. And so that we started to see like 2 centers. But I personally do not see the signs or the evidence suggesting that Xi Jinping anyway will not be able to succeed in his third term. Of course, all the internal struggles, basically the CCP itself is very opaque. No one could actually see through what is happening there, just like the Xi Jinping. But right now it seems the odds still bet on the Xi Jinping to be able to successfully have the third terms. If you want to bet, that's going to be the one.
Let me add one more thing. I think except COVID and economic pressure, there's a third one, which is there's a strong criticism on how Xi Jinping have been handled foreign policy, especially its fight with competition with the United States. It's on board with Russia in the Ukraine conflict. Those are the very bad foreign policy decisions. So I'm still watching how the China will react to Quad and also react to Biden's Taiwan comment. I mean, these are the sensitive moments, and how China is reacting to this would pretty much would put in the calculation of the 20th Party Congress.
So one reaction is this: China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in the Solomon Islands to sign the security pact, which may lead to a Chinese naval base being stationed there. Why is this worrying for Taiwan, Tongman?
And this is, a lot of people are worrying that China is extending its influence in the South China, in the South Pacific. Especially Australia is very concerned. We know that Australia has just had the election, and the Labour Party supposed to have a new China policy, but no, Labour Party is still continuing what the Liberal had been very hardline on China. And Penny Wong, the new foreign minister, is going to Fiji in order to, just before Wang Yi had been there, and try to rally the support and try to revert, probably, hopefully, to what's going to happen. For Taiwan, it's going to be one of our ally, probably is going to be Australia in the future. Australia is now already a member of Quad. It's very actively participate in the collective security arrangement in Asia Pacific. So if Australia is being blocked by all those 10 security arrangements China has signed with the Pacific Islands, then it's very hard for Australia to come to Taiwan's support in case of an emergency. I think that is one concern Taiwan had.
And in terms of coming to Taiwan's aid, Dr. Lai, even with the nuclear-powered subs, would that make it difficult?
Well, if you look at the Solomon Islands position, it's strategically important. Just look at how many the battle during World War II, especially the sea battle and the island campaign that was basically located in this Solomon Island chains there. So that the Solomon Island, the position is pretty important, and that it's a position where that the United States from Hawaii and Australia, the linkage point that is critical there. And second of all is that if you look at all the 10 countries or 8 countries that the Tongman just said, that China is about to have the pact with those, and with the Solomon Island as a base there, it seems that China is able to probably will use that to extend its naval as well military presence in those areas. And since those countries, although they are small in the Pacific Ocean, but they are located in an important linkage between Taiwan and Hawaii. That's where the U.S. Indo-PACOM stationed. And probably we need to divest some of our forces to secure that line, and so that our overall defense against China will be less. So that the development definitely is something that concerns to Taiwan. And in the past, we always assumed that our East is very pacified, so that we don't have to worry about the possible military threat. But right now, the threat is not that China is going to attack us from the East, but China is going to place all the roadblocks so that support from the East won't be able to come that easily. And it could easily to disrupt those support and delay that kind of the support from the United States, and which could be very critical for our defense against China, an invasion against Taiwan.
Tonglun, one of the island nations, has said that this plan, as you said, this security agreement, and it's a region-wide one, shows China's intent to control the region and threatens regional stability. So how likely do you think it is that the Pacific Island nations will actually agree this plan, this pact with China?
We know that for those islands who used to have security arrangement with Australia, because they used to be in the colonial relationship with Australia. Australia would send the troops, try to maintain order over there, and they have a defense agreement with Australia, help and let Australia to help them to defend. But if now China is replacing Australia in that capacity, then that will be a major threat to Australia. I think that people are seeing this thing from that perspective. Because all those islands are small, their economy is underdeveloped, One Belt, One Road is really a major attraction for them. So this is something the U.S. have been alert. Recently, Kurt Campbell had led a delegation going to there and try to put more foreign support and even set up an embassy over there. So I think now gradually Australia and United States are paying attention to the Pacific Island area, and that could change the situation over there.
Can I turn now to Japan? So Japan sits in between two flashpoints, North Korea and Taiwan, and perhaps that's why it's been stepping up as a key US security ally in Asia. Could Japan, Dr. Lai, be on the brink of a shift away from its war-renouncing constitution that was introduced after World War II?
I would say that the Japan's social inertia and adhering to the peace and constitution is still there. But the problem is that in Japan, when it started to initiate the constitution reform or the amendment process, you need to have an intra-party, a cross-party negotiation. And with the existence of the Pure Peace Party, Komeito, you are ensured that this process will be killed right at the beginning in the the party negotiation process, unless the LDP decided to abandon the Komeito and decided to work with other like-minded party so that this process can actually move forward. So that I think it is the kind of party structure as well as the party politics in the non-congressional or the foreign policy era that prevent this kind of things to move forward.
Tonglun, after a 2% increase in GDP for Japan's defense spending and the possibility to include this counter-strike capability, the enemy base attack capability, will it completely transform Japan's defense?
I think what Yi Zhong had just mentioned, it's very difficult for a constitution amendment right now to change Japan. Especially the social initiative have been so great. But gradually, there's going to be some changes. For instance, this time, President Biden had mentioned, had talked with Japan about so-called extended deterrence, meaning that in the future, it's possible to start to think whether Japan should have nuclear capability or not, nuclear weapon capability. And also, the current Prime Minister had mentioned the preemptive strike capability. Those are the concepts that is very new for Japan. They have to have certain amount of time to getting adopt and getting used to that idea. And also, I think now Japan had to figure out itself. I think part of the reason why Biden wants to mention the Taiwan support in the statement is exactly to show Japan that U.S. would not would certainly come to Taiwan's help, and there's no doubt about it. So Japan have to prepare for that scenario and come to U.S. support. I think that is another thing that U.S. want to encourage Japan to move forward. Just like now in Europe, U.S. is want to encourage Germany to move forward and increase the defense budget.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much to my guests for joining us today, and thank you to the viewers for joining Taiwan Plus Point. For more information, please download the Taiwan Plus app. See you next time.